Alexander's victory at the Jaxartes had secured his northern border. However, his choice to focus on the border meant that the revolt of Bactria and Sogdiana had continued, and that Spitamenes remained at large. The revolt would prove to be Alexander's greatest challenge, and would reveal some of his greatest attributes, such as his military flexibility and his mastery of psychological warfare, but also some of his worst, such as his brutality and pettiness. Today there's no one with as much power over your life as the old kings had, unless someone knows your password, especially if you only have one. Let's look for a moment at our sponsor NordPass, with a special offer at the link down in the description. Everyone knows by now that you're supposed to use unique and difficult to generate passwords for everything. The problem being, of course, that the amount of things that need passwords has run out of control, and half the time you have to use the same old password just to have any chance of keeping access to your nebulous sea of accounts. There is, though, a best of both worlds solution: NordPass. It's a program that runs on your computer or mobile device that handles all of your password business. When you start an account, it will generate a rock-solid password that can't be easily brute-forced. It's securely stored, hidden on your device, and whenever you log in again, NordPass automatically writes the strange-looking code in for you, and away you go. You don't have to know what it even is, just that it's both safer and easier than doing it in your head. NordPass can analyze and improve your old passwords too, let you know if your password has been leaked online, and it's all heavily encrypted so that only you can use it, on up to 6 devices. As for our offer, you can get a bonus month of NordPass for free if you check it out via our link in the description, or use our code Kings and Generals at checkout. Give it a go. Before the Battle of Jaxartes, Alexander had sent Pharnaces to relieve the siege of Maracanda and bring the revolt of Spitamenes to an end. Pharnaces was only a translator though, not a military man. Alexander had assigned him the task because he thought that Pharnaces' knowledge of the local language and customs would allow him to negotiate with the rebels and help bring the revolt to a swift conclusion. To compensate for his lack of experience, he had also been assigned several of Alexander's officers to act as military advisors. When Pharnaces' force of more than 2,000 infantry and 300 cavalry closed in on Maracanda, Spitamenes pulled back. Pharnaces pursued eagerly, unaware that he was being lured into a trap. On the edge of the Sogdian desert, near the river Polytimetus, Spitamenes' army was reinforced by 600 Massagetae cavalry and turned to face Pharnaces. The Massagetae cavalry peppered the Macedonian infantry with missile fire and used quick hit-and-run tactics to harass their flanks. The Macedonian cavalry, outnumbered and less agile, was unable to drive the enemy off, and it was soon clear that the army was in a disastrous position. The infantry formed a square and retreated to nearby woods, aiming to cross the river. Without a decisive leader at their head, the officers assigned to Pharnaces communicated poorly, the cavalry crossing the river first, and the infantry following without having been given an order to do so. The crossing was chaotic, and Spitamenes' force kept harassing the force as they crossed, some of his men managing to cross the river at other forts and attack Pharnaces from the opposite bank. Pharnaces' force was now surrounded, and the entire force of 2,000 infantry and 300 horsemen were either cut down or captured. It was the largest military loss Alexander's army ever suffered in Asia. Alexander, returning from the Jaxartes and hearing the news, immediately marched on Maracanda, where Spitamenes had returned to besiege. Upon hearing of his approach, Spitamenes again retreated westwards towards the desert, with Alexander in pursuit. Spitamenes began to withdraw further into the desert. Alexander, however, could not be so easily lured and turned his army back to Maracanda, burying Pharnaces' dead en route as best he could. Unable to catch Spitamenes, Alexander proceeded to carry out brutal reprisals on the Sogdians. For the rest of summer 329, his army devastated the area, burning fields of crops, and according to Rufus, Alexander ordered the death of all men of military age. The total number killed during this period cannot be known for sure, but some modern historians suggest that the number may have been as high as 120,000. Despite this, the revolt continued, and Alexander found himself embroiled in a guerrilla war, unable to defeat his enemies in one decisive battle. To adapt to this, Alexander split his army into parts, under the commands of Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Perdiccas Coenus, and himself. This could be considered one of the earliest examples of a corps system that Napoleon Bonaparte would use so successfully to his advantage 2 millennia later. Each of these corps would operate independently, suppressing any resistance they could. At the same time, Alexander founded a further 6 cities in the area to try and bring the province under control once and for all. However, even after he received reinforcements of 20,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry from the western satrapies and Greece, the revolt persisted. In the spring of 328, the army rejoined at Marikanda. The governor of the province, Anabasis, had asked to retire due to his old age, and Alexander accepted, appointing Cleitus the Black as his replacement. While in the city, Alexander and his officers performed a religious ritual, which, as was often the case, later developed into a drinking party. The sources vary about exactly what was said by who, but as the evening progressed and all the men became drunk, some of the younger officers began to praise Alexander, comparing him to Heracles, to the annoyance of the older officers. Soon after, Alexander himself even began to claim that he was superior to his father, Philip. At this point, Cleitus, who had fought under Philip and whose sister had helped raise Alexander, spoke up, saying, "Alexander's deeds were neither in fact so great or marvelous, nor had he achieved them by himself, but for the most part they were the deeds of the Macedonians." Cleitus even began praising Parmenion and criticizing Alexander for allowing Persians into his court and embracing more Persian customs, at which point Alexander leapt up, calling Cleitus a coward. Cleitus retorted, "It was this cowardice of mine, however, that saved your life, God-born as you are," referencing when he had saved Alexander at the Granicus. Alexander lunged at Cleitus, but was held back by his personal bodyguards, who also discreetly removed his sword, trying to defuse the situation. Alexander called for his other guards, but none came, and Cleitus was effectively dragged out of the room by other officers. With Cleitus gone, Alexander's friends tried to calm him, begging him to leave the matter for tomorrow. As they were doing so, though, Cleitus burst back into the room, quoting a line of Euripides, "Alas, in Hellas what an evil government." Enraged, Alexander grabbed a spear from one of the guards and stabbed Cleitus, killing him. Alexander immediately regretted his actions and turned the spear around, about to kill himself, but was restrained by his bodyguards. They then carried the king to bed, where Alexander remained for the next few days, refusing food and drink, weeping and crying out Cleitus's name. It is important to understand that this was not just a case of a friend killing a friend. By killing Cleitus at a banquet where they had shared food and drink, Alexander had broken the rules of Xenia, the rules of Greek hospitality that were sacred to Zeus, who Alexander had been proclaimed the son of. Numerous attempts to console him, including from court historian and philosopher Callisthenes, failed. It was only when Anabasis, another philosopher, pointed out to Alexander that as the King of Kings and son of Zeus Ammon, the laws did not apply to him in the same way, that Alexander was pulled out of his depression. Though Alexander clearly did regret his actions, the death of Cleitus does reveal a dark side to Alexander. Carney, a leading Alexander historian, has argued that Cleitus's death, while not planned, may have been motivated in part by the justification that Anabasis provided, that Alexander wanted to rule as the unquestionable King of Kings, in contrast to traditional Macedonian monarchy where nobles like Cleitus would often feel free to criticize their king. Moreover, as stressed by Worthington, the episode shows how petty Alexander could be, particularly when it came to comparisons between him and his father. While all this had been going on, Spitomenes and his Massagetian allies were still at large, having avoided Alexander's forces, and were harassing cities in Bactria, extracting bribes from some and defeating at least one garrison that sallied out against him. Alexander again decided to split his force, sending part of the army into Bactria, forcing Spitomenes to retreat towards the Macedonian border. Cleitus, in command of part of the army, heard of this and moved his force to try and catch Spitomenes once and for all, catching up to his 1,000-strong force on the edge of a desert. In the ensuing battle, Cleitus was able to secure a victory, but the majority of Spitomenes' agile force was able to escape, having lost just 150 men. Despite this setback, Spitomenes had nevertheless been largely successful in his guerrilla campaign, with even more men from Macedon, increasing his force to 4,000. When Spitomenes and this army arrived back in Sogdiana, sometime near the end of 328 or the start of 327, they found the province well defended by the new forts Alexander had constructed, all with strong garrisons. Chorienes, stationed in the area by Alexander with a force of approximately 4,000 infantry, 400 cavalry, and an unknown number of horse archers that had recently been added to Alexander's army, set out in pursuit. Spitomenes, seeing that there were no easy targets in the province to attack, finally decided to meet the Macedonians in a pitched battle near Bage. The details of the battle are unknown, but the result was a victory for Chorienes, Arrian giving his losses as being just 32, while Spitomenes lost 800. These numbers, particularly Chorienes' casualties, are likely inaccurate, but it is clear that it was a decisive victory for Chorienes. Spitomenes himself survived the battle, but was soon betrayed by the Macedonians, who cut off his head and sent it to Alexander to make peace. Spitomenes had been one of the most tenacious opponents Alexander had faced, using guerrilla warfare to maximize the effectiveness of his smaller force, consistently avoiding being pinned down, and had even inflicted the largest military defeat on Alexander's army. His death meant that the end of the Bactrian-Sogdian revolt was almost in sight, with only a few local tribes in mountainous citadels continuing to defy Alexander. The taking of these fortresses would require some of the most creative tactics in Alexander's career. The most notable of these holdouts was the so-called Sogdian Rock, a mountain fortress under the command of Anabasis, where a number of rebellious tribal leaders and their families had sought refuge. Early in 327, Alexander left his winter quarters of Nautica and advanced towards the Sogdian Rock. On the march, however, a colossal blizzard swept in, and temperatures plummeted. Alexander ordered that huge areas of forest be cut down and burned to keep the men warm, and rode throughout the army, encouraging his men on. But nonetheless, the cold took its toll on many, some men freezing to death as they leaned against trees to take a short rest. The storm continued for 3 days, by the end of which 2,000 of Alexander's men had died. In time, Alexander finally reached the Sogdian Rock, which according to Rufus was garrisoned by as many as 30,000 soldiers. This number is remarkably high, however, and it is possible that Rufus had mistakenly included civilians in his counting. Nevertheless, the rock was widely considered to be unconquerable. It was well defended, with supplies to last a siege for at least 2 years, and was located in a strong defensive location, surrounded by steep cliffs and made even more secure by the winter snow that would make any assault particularly difficult. As a result of these factors, when Alexander arrived with his army and sent emissaries demanding Anabasis' surrender, he was strongly rebuffed, the Sogdians laughing, claiming that Alexander would need winged soldiers to conquer the place. As the siege of Tyre had shown, however, Alexander was not one to be intimidated by the notion of a place being unconquerable. Anabasis had stationed his men on the walls facing Alexander's army, but had neglected to man the cliff at his rear, confident that such an approach would be impossible. Alexander seized on this opportunity. He requested 300 volunteers from his army who had climbing experience, and offered prizes to all who completed the climb, including a handsome reward of 12 talents to the first man to reach the top of the cliff. In order for the move to be kept hidden from Anabasis, the climb would have to be done under the cover of darkness, making the already perilous mission even more dangerous. Nonetheless, Alexander got his volunteers, and after supplying them with iron tent pegs and ropes, they began the climb. It was a difficult ascent, with 30 of the men falling to their deaths, Alexander anxiously watching the top of the cliff throughout the night for the signal from his men that they had succeeded. At dawn, he finally saw his men at the summit waving white sheets as had been prearranged. With these men in position, Alexander moved his main force forward and again requested Ariamazes' surrender. Again he was refused, until Alexander pointed to the top of the cliffs behind Ariamazes' position, saying that he did indeed have winged soldiers. Ariamazes, unable to tell just how many men were threatening his rear, surrendered without a fight. Alexander's force marched in unopposed, and many of the Sogdian nobles were either captured or executed for their part in the revolt. There was only one last place of significance to resistance to Alexander, the Rock of Chorienes, under the command of Siculus. It was also an incredibly well-defended position, surrounded on all sides by steep cliffs and a ravine, with the only path leading to the rock being narrow, steep, and easily defended. Once again, Alexander sent emissaries demanding the Sogdians' surrender, and once again he was rebuffed. Undeterred, Alexander prepared to take another place considered unconquerable. He first constructed ladders, allowing his men to descend into the ravine, where they began the process of hammering stakes into both sides. On top of these, they constructed supports, building a bridge and packing earth on top. Much like at Tyre, Alexander planned to construct a land bridge across the ravine so that his army would be able to attack from level ground. His army was split into 3 rotating divisions that continued to work day and night, but progress was nonetheless slow thanks to the snowy conditions and harassing arrows from Siculus' men. Wooden screens were soon created to protect the workers, and Alexander's men continued the construction, slowly closing in on the Sogdians. To add to the growing intimidation, Alexander also brought up his siege engines in position to begin a bombardment of the defences. Before any attack began, however, Alexander sent a final emissary to the Sogdians. The emissary stressed to Siculus how dire his situation was becoming, and that once Alexander's causeway was complete and the siege engines began firing, his defeat would be inevitable. Disheartened, Siculus also surrendered without a fight. The taking of the Rock of Chorienes marked the end of the Bactrian-Sogdian revolt. Soon after the siege, Alexander took his first wife, a local princess named Roxana. She and her father, Oxyates, had taken refuge at either the Sogdian Rock or Rock of Chorienes, depending on the source. When Alexander first saw her, he is supposed to have fallen in love immediately, considering her the most beautiful woman in Asia. The marriage also served a political purpose for Alexander though, tying him closely to the local nobility and helping to subdue the unruly Bactrians and Sogdians. It had taken Alexander approximately 2 years to completely subdue the 2 satrapies, roughly the same amount of time that it had taken him to conquer lands from the Aegean to Egypt. It was, without a doubt, the most difficult period of Alexander's campaign so far, and cost his army the largest number of casualties. Approximately 5,000 of Alexander's men had been lost to Spitomenes' guerrilla tactics throughout the course of the revolt, and at least a further 2,000 to cold. The revolt had shown that Alexander was not only a master of tactical but also of psychological warfare, taking 2 supposedly unconquerable places without a fight. However, it also highlighted some of the darkest aspects of Alexander's character. Though often benevolent to his enemies, his brutal tactics in Sogdiana showed how willing he was to use fear and force as a means of control. Similarly, the murder of Cleitus showed that, despite how mature and reasonable Alexander could be, he could also be petty, hot-tempered, and tyrannical. His marriage to Roxana, though beneficial in the short term, was unpopular with many in his army, who now had what they considered a barbarian queen, and would prove to be a significant issue in the long run. With the revolt crushed, Alexander was the undisputed master of the Persian Empire. However, even during the revolt, Alexander was planning his next campaign. He would next lead his army beyond the borders of the Persian Empire and into India, and in our next episode, we'll talk about the famous Battle of Hydaspes, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.